So far, the Taliban have been abiding by the commitments they made, first and foremost, to the Russians in that clearly critical negotiation that took place several weeks ago in Moscow. They have so far acted with a measure of discipline and restraint, something which perhaps what might not have been expected of what is, after all, a militia. And there's no reports so far of any extreme violence or terrifying actions taking place in Kabul itself, though there have been attempts by some sections of the media in the West to pretend that such things are taking place. I have to say that I find that rather objectionable. It almost seems to me as if some mainstream news media outlets would almost want the Taliban to behave as it did back in the 1990s, because that would provide some kind of justification for the actions of the Western powers over the last 20 years. Anybody who really wishes peace in Afghanistan must hope that, on the contrary, the discipline that the Taliban are showing actually at the moment continues to prevail, and that some kind of peace is indeed restored to that unhappy country. Anyway, we will see how events turn out. But the diplomacy, as I said, goes on, and we've had a number of statements from the Russians and from the Chinese about events there. And the long and the short of it is that the Russians and the Chinese are holding out the possibility of recognition for the government that the Taliban forms, but that will be conditional upon the Taliban's good behavior, or at least good behavior as the Russians and the Chinese interpret it. And perhaps before we proceed in too much detail and discuss what the actual diplomatic moves are at the moment, it might be worthwhile recalling what those pledges that the Taliban made both to Moscow and to the Chinese in a subsequent trip to Tianjin are. They are briefly setting up an inclusive government that will bring together all the various communities that make up Afghanistan. That is important because the Russians and the Chinese doubt that the Taliban is going to be able to control Afghanistan for a prolonged period by itself, and they both see an inclusive government as necessary to bring peace and stability to the country, to the whole of the country, not just to the Pashtun areas where the Taliban are firmly in control. And as I've said, they will be pointing out to the Taliban that it is in its own interests to achieve that, if its real purpose in Afghanistan is to achieve peace there. And they have also pointed out to the Taliban that means that the Taliban must act with a certain measure of restraint, a return to the extreme fundamentalist Salafi policies that were pursued in Afghanistan in the 1990s, keeping women away from education, locking them up basically in their homes, imposing the most savage forms of Sharia law on the country. None of that is going to achieve peace in Afghanistan, because far too many people in Afghanistan, including people with guns, will see that as oppressive, and ultimately it will prove unsustainable, and it will only prolong the Afghan wars. And the other things that the Russians and the Chinese have been saying is that they want the Taliban to act on its pledges to keep Afghanistan free of Islamic terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and indeed to wage war upon those groups and the followers of those groups. And in the case of the Russians, they also want the Taliban to start taking steps to try to bring opium production and heroin trafficking in the country to an end. So those were the promises that the Russians extracted from the Taliban during that trip to Moscow. They would have impressed on the Taliban, as the Chinese would have done when they met with the Taliban in Tianjin a short time later, that it is in the Taliban's own interests to abide by these conditions, but that if the Taliban do abide by those conditions, then Afghanistan, the government that the Taliban establishes in Afghanistan, will receive diplomatic recognition from the Russians and from the Chinese, and the two countries will take steps to integrate Taliban in the Eurasian institutions that they are creating, the Belt and Road Initiative of the Chinese, the Eurasian Economic Union of the Russians, and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which the previous Taliban government, the previous Afghan government, that of President Ghani, said that Afghanistan would one day join. So that is, if you like, the bait that the Russians and the Chinese are holding out. That is also the advice that the Russians and the Chinese are giving. It will be up to the Taliban now to see whether they act on that advice and take that bait. And we must hope, for the sake of the people of Afghanistan, that they will do so. But I will say that the first signs are actually positive. The underlying message is the same as the one the Russians are giving. The Chinese will wait and see how the Taliban behaves in Afghanistan, if it behaves wisely, if it carries out the pledges that it made to Moscow and Beijing over the course of the negotiations in July, then China, like Russia, will indeed recognize the new government that is formed in Afghanistan, and like Russia, it will move forward and provide Afghanistan with the economic aid it needs to achieve peace and reconstruction. So that is the steps that the Russians and the Chinese are taking. They are waiting and seeing, and they are judging the Taliban on its actions. Up to now, as I have said, the Taliban seem to be heeding the advice that the Russians and the Chinese have given them. They seem to be working in the kind of direction that they promised the Russians and the Chinese that they would, and hopefully they will continue to do so, and peace and reconstruction will indeed be established in Afghanistan. If the Taliban, however, takes a different turn, then they will find the Russians and the Chinese hostile, and the Russians have moved troops to the border of Afghanistan. They've deployed more troops along the border in Uzbekistan and in Tajikistan, making them able and ready to intervene. And as the Global Times editorial pointedly reminded the Taliban, the Chinese People's Liberation Army is also heavily deployed along Afghanistan's borders in the Wuhan corridor. So that is the proposal that both the Chinese and the Russians are making.